This video is the second in a series showing the gameplay from the Modern Challenge that took place on the 29th of September, in which I finished top 4 playing my build of 4-color Keruga Omnath, which you see in front of you here. I will be giving my play-by-play commentary for the games in round 2 of the challenge, and if you missed the previous round's gameplay, there will be a playlist containing the rest of the videos for this Modern Challenge in the description, so please check that out. Also, the deck list and the free sideboard guide for this deck are also included in the description, so yeah, check those out as well. With all that said, let's get on to the games. Round 2, Game 1, I lose the die rolls, so my opponent opts to go first. I reveal my companion, but my opponent does not reveal a companion, so we're playing in the blind. I decide to keep this 7, it's a pretty good 7, into the blind. I have Flage as a value engine and removal, should I need it. The Fairy, if my opponent's doing something really unfair, maybe like Living End. And Leyline Binding as a general catch or removal. 4 lands, so my mana is under me. And 2 fetch lands to fetch some Surveil lands to try and find some action, some better cards. All in all, a pretty good 7. My opponent plays Bloodstained Mire, and I draw the Misty Rainforest. I decide to play it first. So as a general rule, you want to play Misty first, because 1, it's usually the worst fetch land in the hand, and 2, it can fetch either Lush Portico or Thundering Falls, so it gives you that flexibility. It's most likely that I'm fetching Thundering Falls here because I have Temple Garden and I have 4 out of the 5 colors I need for Domain, which allows me to play Leyline Binding on turn 2 off 2 lands. Arid Mesa is the second best fetch here, and Flood Strand is the best fetch in this hand, so we want to hold the Flood Strand for as long as possible. Depending on what happens in the next turn, we'll either play the Temple Garden or the Arid Mesa. Opponent fetching Undercity Sewers makes me lean towards them being blue-black Psychic Frog, Murktide, or the High Kick Frog Oculus deck. And my opponent just leaves up Counterspell mana, and I do the fetch of the Thundering Falls that I mentioned earlier, and bin a land, because we got plenty of lands. And I play the Arid Mesa here, because now that I think that my opponent's on blue-black, I immediately think about Harbinger of the Seas. And therefore, I want to fetch the Mountain as soon as possible. Mountain is really nice because it means that we have way more outs to resolve Harbinger of the Seas. So not only the Solitude out it, you can out it even without a Plains. With the Dead Gons, with the Rough Tumble, and with the Fire Ice. And if you have the Plains, it's not just Leyline Binding that outs it now, you can also out it with Flage with the Mountain. And that's why we run the Arid Mesa, you can fetch Plains or Mountain. It's a nice basic to run. There's actually a variety of uses of the Mountain, which we won't discuss right now, but it's pretty good. And then my opponent just plays Bowmaster. We do nothing here, just attacking. And I decide to fetch the Mountain immediately, just to get it out of the way. And now we draw the Windswept Heath. And I use the Flood Strand now, because holding the Windswept Heath lets me fetch out Forest, potentially, if I really want to get all the basics that are relevant to play around a potential Harbinger of Decease from my opponent. We got a good suite of basics so far, Mountain Plains against a potential Harbinger, and I'm gonna use the Flaich to try and out the Bowmaster. But my opponent counters it. It's a really good play, I think, because they're just protecting this clock. They know that their way of winning this game is just this chip damage. Eventually I get low enough. I try and come back into the game against like a big Murktide. But the Bowmasters and the token has done the damage. And all because they decide to protect the clock this early on. This isn't actually a bad exchange for us. But it's a really good play, really heads up play from my opponent. Really understanding their role in this matchup. That's the power of Flaich, even if the opponent counters it, it's always a card. And now, I decide to play Cavern. And a name Elemental. So, there's been a lot of debate around this, Flaich, and a bunch of Elementals being in the same deck, along with Cavern of Souls. And I know some people say that, oh, it's a really hard choice, it's almost kind of a non-bow, what do you choose? It's really simple. You pretty much, like 99% of the time, choose Elemental. And here's the reason. Flaich is mainly there in this kind of matchup. If it doesn't resolve, its job is to rip these out of your opponent's hand. That's its job. The elementals are far more important because they perform a wide range of functions. So endurance, graveyard hate, solitude removal. Omnath is actually how you make more plays. It was pretty much almost always correct to name Elemental and Cavern Souls. It's not a non-bow, it's not a difficult choice, it's really easy. Just name Elemental. The times you name the type lines on Flaich with the Cavern Souls are against stuff like Jeskai Control, where they have far more counter magic, far more interaction like that. So you just want to keep repeatedly casting Flaich into all their stuff and ripping it out bit by bit. Or you just ignore their interaction by forcing through the Flaich with the Cavern Souls. But in this matchup, it's pretty much Elemental 99% of the time you name. I'm going to try and attempt to stem the bleeding here by presenting a blocker for this clock that my opponent has with the Bowmasters and the Orc Army. And yeah, Cavern is great. It's very necessary, I think, in this format, just because of this deck and similar. Just forcing through these really key cards like Omnath, Solitude, Endurance. It's just great. Opponent finds the third land and it's a fetch land, so yep, get fail pushed. They clear my blocker. And I draw another Leyline Binding into my turn. Now I have a decision to make. So I decided to play the Temple Garden to get 4 out of the 5 colors for Domain, because the next play is probably going to involve the Leyline Binding. Actually, let's go through all the possible plays. So I could play Teferi, that's bad into Counterspell. I could play the Ring, also bad against Counterspell, and actually even worse into anything that could counter. So sometimes these decks, main deck, consign to memory and stuff like that. So I'm not particularly interested in just jamming Ring here. Ring is also really precious since while I have the Flaich as a repeating source of value, it's also dependent on how many cards I have in my graveyard, and I'll eventually run out of those. If they're running something like Cling to Dust, I can't rely on the Flaich. My opponent also told me they pretty much understand the role there in this matchup by countering the Flaich, which I attempted to cast to hit the Bowmaster with this counterspell. So I already know they value their clock very highly, but I value my ways of getting value very highly as well. So the correct play is to try and remove this clock. So I'm already quite a low life, and this counterspell has pretty much done a good job of forcing through this clock. So I gotta get rid of this now. I think my mistake in this game was playing this playing out this plan that I just described on my turn, because they're actually constrained on mana here. They actually can't present counterspell plus another counter. They can only present counterspell or two counters, and they have to be two 1-mana counters. So I should play the cards that you see now being played on my opponent's turn to tap them out, but yeah, that was the mistake of this game. My opponent has interaction. The main deck consign. It's pretty good. And yeah, just tapping out on my turn for no good reason. Get them untap with all this blue mana. And now they Harbinger of the Seas. But we're okay, because we have the mountain and plains, so we have place to get under this. Now I have another choice to make. So this Winds Up Teeth definitely getting played. I could Jam the Ring, which is pretty bad if they have Force Negation. But if they don't, it's also pretty bad. It doesn't actually accomplish anything, since they just untap with double blue, and then it's likely that I don't resolve anything else the rest of the game. So we're not playing the ring. I could do Teferi plus Fable. But the problem with that is, while Fable presents a blocker, Teferi can't actually tick down. It doesn't actually do anything. When it ticks down, it bounces something, but then the token gets bigger. I probably lose more life. And if they have Fail Push or any other removal for the Fable token, I'm just dead. So the only play available to me is play the Windswept Heath, use the Leyline Binding on the Harbinger, and then check to see if that resolves. If that doesn't resolve, so if the Leyline Binding gets forced negations, then I have to try and survive with Fable of the Mirror Breaker, which I can cast. So I'd play this, tap only the plains, and leave the mountain untapped. If the Leyline Binding doesn't resolve, I play the Fable. But if the Leyline Binding does resolve, I want to play Teferi and uptick. Because remember, as I said, down ticking doesn't actually do anything here. It just makes the token bigger. And if you bounce the Bowmasters, it just makes the token bigger and they attack you face. I uptick because that gives me the best chance. If they don't deal with the Teferi, it gives me the best chance of actually resolving something that outs this board state. And that is indeed what I do. Yeah, they just attack me. There's no reason to attack this Teferi. It's not going to die. And my opponent has a Harbinger of the Seas #2, which isn't too bad here. And I bounce the Harbinger, so then I can try and play the Flage to out the token, the Orc Army token, gain a bit of life, and reduce their clock in the process. It also frees up my Windswept Heath, which I can use to fetch the forest, so I have all the basics I need to play under the Harbinger of the Seas. Yep, they have the Fail Push. So I was right to get rid of the token and not the Bowmasters. Because if I get rid of the Bowmasters, they Fail Push. That's actually a lot of damage, and I can't fetch my forest to play around the Harbinger of the Seas that I just bounced and will come back down, most certainly this turn. And this play is pretty straightforward. You just slam Fable and Ring. Ring buys you a turn of no damage. Fable presents a blocker, and if we can risk it, a loot, but I don't think we'll need a loot since we have the Solitudes already. Opponent has the Archmage's Charm to remove my blocker, so I take this chance to remove the Harbinger of the Seas. Luckily, we draw Omnath. So the play here would be Omnath, and in response to the trigger, I would fetch with the Aradmisa a Lush Portico, so I could fix my draw, plus gain life before the ping triggers on the Bowmaster. So I'm pretty much always above 1 life, playing it this way. Yep. I keep the Solitude on top. It's a little bit of a gamble, but I kind of have to do it at this point. Because I don't think winning this is better. If they have a removal spell, I'm dead. But they already used up 2 Fatal Push, so... And they would need Revolt before attackers, which is the only way they can do that guaranteed right now is the Goblin Shaman, and there's a Teferi, so they'd have to attack, but then they can't trigger Revolt and cast a Fatal Push at the same time. So I'm safe if they don't draw something like a Shoot the Sheriff, which they don't seem to, so I survive. I just block the Goblin Shaman. Opponent presents the Psychic Frog. And yeah, at this point, I think it's past the point of no return. I just keep gaining with the Omnath. I have the Solitude. Solitude just deals with the Psychic Frog. We don't draw any more cards. And I have Fable flipped. I use the Flage to make sure my life total is really flush. Get rid of the Bowmaster, start drawing with this One Ring. Try and keep drawing more fetch lands or just lands in general. Get my life total well out of range. The flipped Reflection pretty much controls the game here with the Solitude on board. As long as this is up, opponent isn't keeping a creature on board. And yeah, at this point is just making sure I attack quickly enough to make sure the clock, because I'm 2 minutes behind, make sure the clock doesn't catch up to me. And yeah, I just use the triple trigger from Omnath to deal the last points of damage to go for game. So we got a little lucky there with the Omnath not dying on that last turn where they could attack with 4 power with the creatures. I won the last game, so I'm on the draw again for this game. Keep a decent 7. So I have all my lands under me with 4 lands, 2 fetch lands, both which can fetch a plains and a forest should I want to play around Harbinger of the Seas. Mystical Dispute, so I can counter a potential turn 2 Psychic Frog. Teferi, if I want to have a slightly longer game plan to use this Mystical Dispute to protect the Teferi on like a turn 4. And the One Ring as a way to try and win the game outright. So decent hand. This is mostly a repeat of the previous game so far in the first 2 turns, so play Misty Rainforest first. Fetch Undercity Sewers. Presenting Counterspell mana again. I shock in the Steam Vents here because I want to keep up Disputes, but I also want to potentially fetch a Forest with this Misty Rainforest should I need to, so I'm not going to crack it immediately. And my opponent just flashes into Bowmasters and starts the beats again. It's like last game. I decide to use the Misty Rainforest to get a Lush Portico, since I want to try and find maybe something that gets me to, say, an Endurance, or just something better than what I've got right now. I got a Leyline Binding, which is actually quite nice, so I can use this on a potential Psychic Frog and save the Mystical Dispute if that comes up. And now that I see the game is kind of going the way the last game went, where they just beat me down with like an Orcish Bowmasters or something small like this, I've got to try and deal with this clock. This is a lot of life I'm losing right now. So I try to Leyline Binding the Orcish Bowmasters. My opponent correctly counters the Leyline Binding. I don't fight back with Disputes because, as I said earlier, I want to maybe try and resolve this Teferi. Opponent shocks in a land, so that makes me think it might just have a 3-mana counter like an Archmage's Charm. Try and play the Teferi. They have Disputes, I have Disputes, but they shocked, which means they can counterspell. So my Teferi does not resolve. And they resolve a Harbinger of the Cease. And at this point, if this ring doesn't resolve, I've pretty much lost the game. Yeah, I get down really low, and then, yep, I just lose since I don't have an out to this. Board state, that was a pretty quick game. But yeah, we kept a good hands. And it didn't work out. That's just the power of Harbinger of the Seas. On to the next game. Round 2, game 3. I lost the last game, so I'm on the play the first time in this match. So I keep this 7. And the reason is I have Endurance, which is a great play against blue-black. You just flash it at end step and force my opponent to either make a decision on the counterspell, or I get to resolve it and beat them down, get their life total really low, and force the issue on a couple of things with my opponent, putting them on the back foot, maybe flash in at the Shadow's Tidebinder as well, to really amplify the clock. I also have an immediate out to a turn 2 Psychic Frog in the form of Solitude, Pitch to Fairy. This also outs a turn 3 Harbinger if they don't present a Psychic Frog. So this hand's okay. It could be better, but it's not something that I'd try and mull. Especially when we have a minimum of 3 lands and we have a fetch land to potentially find the 4th. Just play the Misty. Fetch Thundering Falls. I think it's important to try and get Domain first for as many colors. And I keep the Breeding Pool. That gets me my 4th land. I shock to bluff a Leyline Binding just because I have the life total. Usually do this because if I'm losing against blue-black, I'm usually losing on like quite high life total margins, so I think this bluff is worth it. Maybe influences that decision. And they have the Psychic Frog. I don't use the Solitude immediately here in this case because I don't have a second white card, and I actually want to play around subtlety a little bit, which the Shadow's Tidebinder would let me do. Suppose I do have a second white card, I would have actually fired off the Solitude immediately there. Because say my opponent has a Salty, I just put this back on top and then use the second white card that I have in hand to pitch again, and that forces through the Psychic Frog if my opponent also doesn't have a second Salty. But with the way my hand is right now, I cast a Solitude on my turn, see if I draw another white card. Maybe something worse than a Teferi to pitch. Maybe like an Omnath. So I cast a Solitude with the Shadow's Tidebinder back up, and the Solitude resolves. So now what I actually get to do is, because Tisha's Tidebinder doesn't have too many good targets if they don't present a fetch land here, and even if they do present a fetch land, they still have a counterspell they can cast on the Tisha's Tidebinder. I can just counter the Evoke trigger instead on the Solitude, and now I have a clock. They do have the fetch land, but I still like this play because I get to beat them down, especially with the Endurance in hand, so I can really lean on that aggro play of just committing to the board. I know this plays into a Bowmasters on one of these creatures, but I think it's worth it to just attack anyway. And I take this opportunity to resolve the Endurance, just in case they have a bunch of Murktides maybe in hand that they could really quickly put down on the board. And this also develops the board and makes up for the creature I will lose on this exchange with the Orc Army token. Fetch the Plains just to get it out of my deck. Going into my turn, I play the islands I have and draw a Mystical Dispute. Pretty nice. Just attack. My Endurance after attack, since the end step, gets hit with a Shoot the Sheriff. And with only 1 mana up, and the fact they had 1 mana up last turn and didn't do something like a Cling to Dust, I'm going to assume they don't have it. And I use a Cosmic Rebirth to bring back this Endurance, just so that I can keep maintaining the clock. Cosmic Rebirth is really great in these counterspell matchups because it can make these 3 mana permanents like Teferi be cast at instant speed. Obviously, Endurance can still already be cast at instant speed, but the Teferi interaction is pretty relevant in this matchup and other similar matchups. So Cosmic Rebirth is great as a way to essentially make certain cards you want in specific matchups redundant by 1 card, which is what the Cosmic Rebirth represents. So we just beat down again, and my opponent drowns in the lock. They can't take too much damage. Makes sense. And we have Dispute backing up the Fabled Mirrorbreaker, which is a really nice thing to have here. Opponent responds with Dispute, responds with our Dispute, and resolves the Fable. So we're quite ahead at this point. Just got to close out the game and hopefully not run into a Murktide. Add the Keruga to hand playing the Forest, which is a really nice draw as well, because now we have 2 basics to play with under the Harbinger of the Seas they could have, and opponent scoops after this. I assume their hand is just counter spells. So the attack just goes through. Okay, so yeah, that was round 2. I think it was a pretty good showcase of cards like Cosmic Rebirth and Endurance for this game, and that here even the one of Tisha's Tidebinder doing a lot of work really rounds off the deck nicely.